Hey, this is D-Doc, and welcome back to my Jungian Typology series, where I basically attempt to explain Jungian typology. So we're continuing on with sensation functions, and today we're mostly going to go over introverted sensation. So let's get started. Alright, so now we are going to talk about introverted sensation. Starting with Michael Pierce's definition, introverted sensation is perceiving what is subjectively denoted. Diary, recounting, this is how I witnessed Mr. Body's murder. Also, further within the chapter, Michael says that, quote, what others pass over as unimportant, the introverted sensor always takes notice of, due to their unique personal history with the thing. The introverted sensor's attention is not earned through flashy presentation, but through personal connection. One senses all that a thing represents for them, even more than they sense the thing itself. And in the next paragraph he says that, quote, truth is thus proportionate to the degree of its subjective presence, and a sensation is subjectively present to the degree that it resembles one of the subject's archetypal sensations. Introverted sensation abstracts from experience those elements it considers truly important, separating the wheat from the chaff, and forming a number of ideal sensations by which all new incoming sensations are understood. According to Jung in his book, Psychological Types, he said the predominance of introverted sensation produces a definite type, which is characterized by certain peculiarities. It is an irrational type because it is oriented amid the flux of events, not by rational judgment, but simply by what happens. Whereas the extroverted sensation type is guided by the intensity of objective influences, the introverted type is guided by the intensity of the subjective sensation excited by the objective stimulus. Obviously, therefore, no proportional relation exists between object and sensation, but one that is apparently quite unpredictable and arbitrary. What will make an impression and what will not can never be seen in advance and from outside. Did there exist an aptitude for expression in any way proportional to the intensity of his sensations, the irrationality of this type would be extraordinarily striking. This is the case, for instance, when an individual is a creative artist. But since this is the exception, the introvert's characteristic difficulty in expressing himself also conceals his irrationality. On the contrary, he may be conspicuous for his calmness and passivity, or for his rational self-control. This peculiarity, which often leads a superficial judgment astray, is really due to his unrelatedness to objects. Normally, the object is not consciously devalued in the least, but a stimulus is removed from it and immediately replaced by a subjective reaction no longer related to the reality of the object. This naturally has the same effect as devaluation. Such a type can easily make one question why one should exist at all, or why objects in general should have any justification for their existence, since everything essential still goes on happening without them. This doubt may be justified in extreme cases, but not in the normal, since the objective stimulus is absolutely necessary for sensation and merely produces something different from what the external situation might lead one to expect. Jung's writings are overall very hard to understand, especially the first time you're reading them. And for me personally, I had to read the text multiple times in order to fully understand what he's saying. But I do think, at least within the quote that I provided, he is talking about a similar thing that Michael Pierce had talked about, which is that the introverted sensor has to relate to the object in a personal way, in a very subjective way. And as a result of doing that, the object no longer becomes very objective in the same way that extrinsic sensation would make it objective, would keep it objective. The information becomes more subjective and therefore the objective qualities become devalued, or rather diluted. Another thing I want to say about Jung's writings is that they do have a tendency to focus on the person with a specific cognitive function, with a specific type and their behaviors, rather than being focused on defining the cognitive functions. And that does make it a little harder to understand the cognitive function itself. So that's something else to keep in mind when reading his work. In Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, quote, introverted sensing is understanding the world through past, precedent, and experience. I think they meant the past, the precedent, and experience, whatever. People who are introverted sensors thrive on routine, tradition, organization, and rules. They are often very attuned to their bodies and have specific ways of doing things that work for them in order to get the job done. They are responsible, reliable, and cautious. This doesn't make a very good definition for the cognitive function itself, because this is just a list of behaviors that we associate with introverted sensors, and they might be good at these behaviors, but that's not a definite, and that shouldn't be the definition for the cognitive function itself. Also, this can be seen as very stereotypical as well. So, moving on to objective personality's definition of introverted sensation, they basically define this function as organizing observable facts, consistency, sensory, written out line by line. The video I got this from was Sensing Extraverted Sensation versus Introverted Sensation. That's one of their videos on their YouTube channel. A representation or analogy he uses to demonstrate introverted sensation within the video is a recipe where there is a list of facts that you have to follow in order to get to a cake that you want to make, in order to make the cake properly. And so that is how objective personality sees introverted sensation. I don't agree with this. I think introverted sensation is much more than that. If I were to use the same recipe example, I would have made it more routine oriented. So it's supposed to be like, okay, so this is the routine of making this food. This recipe is supposed to guide me in making that food. So, and the thing about introverted sensation is that at a certain point, the more you do something, the less likely you need a recipe for it. So, because eventually it just becomes so ingrained into you that you know exactly how much water something needs, how much flour something needs, how long the cake needs to bake in the oven for, that sort of stuff. It does not need to be written down. It's just more routine oriented. But it's not only about routines or traditions. It's about the impressions of an object, of the sensory, and how that impression routinely gets ingrained into you. So you'll see more of that as we continue going into these definitions. Cognitive typology, photology. Introverted sensation as an introverted perceiving function. Introverted sensation has a long cycle of decay, keeping information schemas perpetually suspended in consciousness as a background process, providing context. These schemas are episodes from the past that have been stored as anecdotes, and which are brought back into awareness as they relate to the situation. All the details relevant to the navigation of that particular situation are re-triggered to the consciousness, effectively rebooting the same simulation or actuality that was entertained originally. This gives introverted sensation a nostalgic capacity, since it stores episodes more or less just the way they were last left, due to introverted sensation being a concrete process which does not alter the properties of its data sets. However, what this means is that introverted sensation's episodes will not be interwoven into a universal or thematic web, but will be indexed as a series of lessons, each relevant to a multitude of different situations. This does not mean introverted sensation gives a person a good understanding of chronology, since the order in which the episodes are stored is not always remembered, but each episode is nonetheless indexed in a somewhat isolated fashion. Introverted sensation will then toggle between schemas as situations change, calling forth those that relate the most to the environment. And when introverted sensation has understood what the context is, they will remember the outcome of this context from before and understand the situation in a consequential fashion, anticipating a similar outcome this time around. So, in short, like I was saying before, introverted sensation, impressions of the object, impressions of the sensory, it stores them away like episodes. And they're not always in chronological order, but these episodes still are stored away, and they come up as they need to when the person needs them. So it's very much a calling back to what was previously stored away. Now, understanding this does not have to do with society's traditions, like as one might stereotypically say about introverted sensation. It's just that if the introverted sensation user was placed in an environment that cherished culturally those traditions, and they too as well were cherishing those traditions, then more likely than not, they're going to be very traditional and conservative in that sense. But that does not necessarily make all introverted sensation users traditional and respectful of traditions. Not every introverted sensation user, not every introverted sensor is going to enjoy Christmas because maybe they didn't grow up in that environment where Christmas was valued. So, just an example, or Thanksgiving or things like that. Like, they have to appreciate those things for themselves. And if they do, then it's going to be very traditional and very routine based in that sense. Casual cognition, also now known as empiricalpersonality.com, it used to be cognitiveaid.com, but as of recently, the website name has changed to empiricalpersonality.com. Introverted sensing is an observational process based on retention and organization. Each observation has stable connections to other observations within the internal structure. Thus, current external information always conjures stored information. These observations are of the sensory realm, which includes specific objects and experiences. Thus, introverted sensing tends to have a good memory of the details. In other words, introverted sensing recalls objects and experiences themselves. Like other introverted processes, introverted sensing leans towards static and self-contained. As more observations occupy the internal structure, subjective categories and connections start forming. Sometimes pieces of sensory information are not related except in memory. An introverted sensor might be watching a romance movie while drinking coffee. Then they associate romance movies with bitterness. And it can take some time and new information to override past associations. So in this definition, you see an example of how introverted sensation works and how it tends to make connections to things where it's only through sensory memory alone. Like, there's no intuitive associations, like, red blood and a red apple, or, none of those intuitive associations that, like, say, extra intuition might have. With introverted sensing, in this example, there's no reason for drinking coffee and the bitterness of coffee to be associated with romance movies. The only reason why it's associated at all, those two are connected at all, is because the introverted sensor had experienced drinking coffee while watching a romance movie. So I find that a very good example of how introverted sensation works. It connects things already in a very subjective manner as compared to extraverted sensation, which wouldn't do that at all. It wouldn't associate the two like that. So now we are switching over to socionics, and what they say about introverted sensation. Keep in mind these are very different from the definitions we just reviewed. Introverted sensation has a theme of homeostasis, continuity, smoothness, flow, satisfaction, aesthetics, quality of life, pleasure, relaxation, convenience, and quality. A physically relaxed state of mind turned to the continuity and flow of the moment. Described as a dynamic information element, one's continuous physical exchanges with one's environment. Described as an introverted information element, person X is comfortable with condition Y or is not. From sociotype.com, introverted sensing is the irrational, introverted, and dynamic information element. It is also referred to as SI, S, experiential sensing, or white sensing, and is represented by a white circle. Introverted sensing is associated with the ability to internalize sensations and to experience them in full detail. Introverted sensing focuses on tangible, direct, external connections, introverted, between processes, dynamic, happening in one time. Tangible, direct connections between processes happening in one time, i.e. the physical, sensual experience of interactions between objects. This leads to an awareness of internal, tangible physical states and how various physical fluctuations or substances are directly transferred between objects, such as motion, temperature, or dirtiness. The awareness of these tangible physical processes consequently leads to an awareness of health, or an optimum balance with one's environment. The individual physical reaction to concrete surroundings is the main way we perceive and define aesthetics, comfort, convenience, and pleasure. World Socionics defines introverted sensation as integrating sensation of senses. We find sensory experiences down to those that are of best quality, seeking to maintain the natural organic flow of one's experiences. This instills an attitude of calm and relaxation, avoiding anything too strenuous or worrisome, being satisfied and content with what is natural, pleasant, and convenient. If you haven't already noticed, there's a very glaring difference between introverted sensation within the previous definitions that we had already reviewed and introverted sensation within socionics. Outside of socionics, introverted sensation seems to be seen more as routine-based, as memory-based, and introverted sensation collects sensory impressions and builds a personal relationship with these sensory impressions. Whereas with socionics, that shifts more to now a homeostasis, comfort-focused definition, which is interesting when compared to socionics' extraverted sensation, which is much more forceful and seeks to dominate the territory around it. It's an interesting dynamic there, whereas extraverted sensation outside of socionics is seen more like an observation function. So it's interesting because now it poses a new question as to which cognitive function is really responsible for that comfort homeostasis part of sensation. The following portion of this video is just me speculating on the differences between extraverted sensation and introverted sensation when a user of either function becomes sensitive, as in quick to detect or respond to negative changes to their environment. When it comes to which cognitive function is more sensitive, extraverted sensation or introverted sensation, I thought that maybe the difference would lie between the fact that one's objective and one's subjective. So the reason why extraverted sensation would be more sensitive is when something in an environment is bothering them at that immediate moment, like an unorganized room, for example. Whereas with introverted sensation, if that unorganized room is actually very organized according to how they have it, like it doesn't matter if it looks messy to the other person, to them, it's organized enough that they can operate within that environment and they feel comfortable enough in that environment. But times when introverted sensation
would not feel comfortable and would become sensitive to something is when they are experiencing something that is disagreeable to their subjective experiences, like a very specific loud noise keeps popping up, and they form a negative association with that loud noise. So as a result, they jump whenever they hear it. So it may not bother the extra sensor who, maybe is at a place of work and they expect to hear that noise, so it doesn't really bother them. They tend to like tune it out or something, or they don't put as much focus on it. But because the introverted sensor has developed an impression to the object to that sensory sound already, and it's a negative one, subjectively they've done that, right? Then that's why they have become sensitive to it. It makes itself known like a sore thumb to them. It's almost designed specifically to annoy them in a way. Whereas when an extrovert sensor becomes sensitive to something, it's because, objectively speaking, it just stands out like a sore thumb. It's not designed to irritate them. They don't have already a subjective. Their subject didn't already build a relationship to that sensory information. But when they look at it, it displeases them. So I think there's a very, very, very nuanced difference there. Personally, I was thinking about this. Like the thing is, I can see both extraverted sensation and introverted sensation having to do with trying to maintain a specific aesthetic. It's just that the way how they go about it is interesting. I wish I could hear more people talk about this specific difference, because it's fascinating to me. I want to really work on this thought, quite frankly.
Depending on what definitions you are using, the answer to this question will change. Within socionics, introverted sensation seems to be the sensitive one out of the two sensory functions. However, outside of socionics, it's easy to think the extraverted sensation is the sensitive one because that function seems to focus more directly on the environment. But just because extraverted sensation has a more direct focus to its environment, that does not mean it is therefore more sensitive. I think either way, it depends on what exactly it is about the sensory irritant that is bothering the person.
Okay. Lastly, we're going to talk about Dario Nardi and his observations of what behaviors introvert sensors typically tend to have. So he includes like one line of definition and goes into the behaviors, and I'm just going to read all of it. Stabilizing with a predictable standard. Carefully compare a situation to the customary ways you've come to rely on. Check with past experiences. Stabilize the situation and invest for future security. Review and practice in order to specialize and meet group needs. Constant practice helps their brain specialize. Improve when watching a role model or example, often in touch with body sensations. Easily track where they are in a task. Use their whole brain to review the past. Strong memory for kinship and raw details. May over-rely on authority for guidance. So, again, this kind of, calls back to the SJs being more traditional and routine, and how they have to have like an authority to like guide them. But not to say that that's wrong, just to say that, that's not everything about introverted sensation, but it's interesting how those qualities are attached there. And they're attached there for specific reasons. It's because of the impressions of the sensory object being made onto those individuals. Anyway, that concludes our discussion on extraverted sensation and introverted sensation and the difference between the two. We're now going to start talking about the intuition functions. So, I'll see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.